Hi, and welcome to Generous Theology. This is an episode with Chuck and Brock, and we cover tonight a discussion in one of the most important chapters in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1. We are in Part 3, the foundations of dogmatic theology, and we're in Chapter 7, the scientific foundations. And within that section, Chuck, which is paragraph 66 for those who are following us, we get to talk about empiricism, which is perhaps one of the most important philosophical concepts and schools of thought to be considered. And I find myself fairly confident, Chuck, with years of experience in Reformed dogmatics and in reading Bavinck. I typically feel that I can read and understand the material well. Not perfectly and not in all aspects, of course, but I usually have a comfort level. And the comfort level is a little bit lower here tonight because I want to make a confession. And that is, Chuck, when it comes to philosophical schools, my own proclivities, my own tendency is to be fairly anti-empiricist in terms of opposing so many of the foundational principles of empiricism. And so we're here today in paragraph 66, and I'm quite concerned because I almost feel like I might need to recuse myself in the sense that I'm not certain I can set aside a very significant bias against empiricism to give as impartial and as accurate and as generous a reading as I think it deserves. Now, Chuck, let's not throw heavy objects in my direction right out of the box here. I'm just saying that this is one of the areas that I feel the least comfortable speaking about in terms of being able to do it justice, being able to represent it fairly. But I still think that Bavinck lets things shine forth enough that we can talk profitably. But all of that to say, I have a love-hate relationship with so many philosophers from the empirical side of things. And I just wondered, Chuck, how is it with you? Do you find in your own thinking that one side or the other, thinking here between rationalism and empiricism as two of the most basic building blocks in philosophy, do you find yourself gravitating naturally toward one side or the other? Do you find one of the sides very difficult to conceptualize? And how does it all weigh up in your end? And what did you think about that as you were going into this essay?
Yeah, it's interesting that I'm not sure how strongly I identify either with rationalism or empiricism, because there is a sense in which sometimes they appear to be opposite sides of the same coin, in that there is a sense in which at least rationalism, as it's been practiced and as it's been theorized about since Kant, has been a rationalism that does not include the supernatural, does not include the transcendent, right? And Kant, we've talked about this a little bit. Kant, said that he wasn't actually waving away the transcendent, but in many ways, the results of his writings are what came later, the waving away of the transcendent. Empiricism very much waves away the transcendent, perhaps more obviously. And so there is a sense in which, I feel like I've often felt like they're opposite sides of the same coin. Another interesting thing, I think, is as you and I were talking about these things when we read through the history book that we did. I can't think of the name of the author off the top of my head, but the Christian philosopher who wrote on the history of philosophy. Again, in reading through a lot of that history, you recognize that, there clearly is a division. We've talked about that Aristotelian arch. I think that's a helpful illustration that you introduced me to. We looked at, Greek thinkers who fell on one side or the other of that divide. And there is a sense that there is also a great difference between rationalism. I think it's also true that among Reformed scholastic, I don't know that I necessarily fall exactly among, the followers of the Reformed scholastics per se, but certainly am more affected by them, that, there aren't really Reformed empiricists. There is a sense in which that rationalist side tends to win the day to some extent. Obviously, it's not a Kantian rationalist side, but Reformed folks have often been accused, even by other Christians, of being far too rationalist in the way that we think about our doctrines. And so there is a sense that perhaps as Reformed folks, we feel a little bit on that side. I think the third thing that's interesting about this is I just in following up a little bit and thinking about where things are going, it's pretty clear that on the one hand, among those who are actually studying and practicing and writing about philosophy in an academic way, empiricism seems to have, in many ways, lost the day. Philosophers tend to fall more on the rationalist side. Now, that's not 100%. There certainly are some that are very much empiricist, but especially in the last several decades, there does seem to be a stronger move away from empiricism. Empiricism is not particularly popular in the philosophy academy, shall we say. That said, I think if we think about more what Doyeweerd would have considered naive thought, just the way people tend to think about things, how the worldview around them affects them. I think practically empiricism is as strong as ever. A lot of people who are not philosophers, but just simply live their life, with a worldview that they may or may not recognize, act as if we live in an empirical world, that really all that is true is what you can perceive, that even that rationally thinking about things and creating things out of your mind is just not the way that a lot of people behave. I also think that to some extent in natural science, among those who aren't particularly philosophers, and obviously there are some philosophers of natural science, those cosmologists and people like that who are thinking about things philosophically. But outside of that, I think there is a sense that a lot of scientists fall on that empirical side. And it often seems to me that even though empiricism may not be in the academy what we as Christians should most be responding to, there is a sense that sort of at the popular level, it is empiricism that we're primarily responding to, because that's just the way the world seems to work. Now, obviously, I don't know that we'll get there today. I think we're going to focus on empiricism for today. But the next time we meet, we're going to talk about something that, whether it's actually an alternative to empiricism and rationalism, or whether it's something of the same, something different. We're going to talk a little bit about realism, and we may talk about some other philosophies of that. And certainly, I think Bavinck falls into that realist side. And there is a sense in which I too tend to reject the empiricism versus rationalism divide, not reject it as being false, not rejecting it as being a good description of how many people think, but reject it as being one or the other being the real answer. But if I'm truthful about it, at times when I start thinking within the boxes that the world puts on us, I think, like you, I probably tend more towards that rationalistic side. Now, I would say that I'm not a anti-transcendental rationalist, very much not that, as I know you are also not an anti-transcendental rationalist either. And so maybe there is something to be said about, like you, I may have more arguments that I can make against empiricism than perhaps against rationalism, even though in the end, I'm not convinced that either one is really the most accurate representation of the way that God has created the world.
Thank you for that, Chuck. Let's try a build out from history here to help ground people in what's at stake. And of course, Bavinck's going to help us here. Now, in some sense, the rationalism versus empiricism debate is an oversimplification of philosophy. There are some tenets of rationalism that can be found in empirical thought, and there's some ideas from empirical thought that are present in rationalism. And part of the Kantian revolution was this synthesis of both, or maybe I should say an attempted synthesis, which we've, like you noted, we talked about in discussions of this arch of Aristotle, this very helpful model. But to go back in time in antiquity, People love to ground philosophical thoughts in the Greeks. And I think if we do that here, we can think of Parmenides as the classic rationalist with his idea of reality being made up of immutable things. And then we can contrast Parmenides with Heraclitus, who, as we mentioned last time, was the philosopher who noted that you cannot step into the same river twice, for everything is in flux, everything is changing. And this idea that there is this immutable, especially a non-material immutability to reality, is very foreign to his thoughts. Now, we see later on, roughly speaking, we see Plato perhaps being representative of the rationalist side, and we see perhaps Aristotle a little bit more on the empirical side. And then Bavinck talks about this idea that nominalism comes out in the Middle Ages as a form of empiricism. And so think here of the nominalism of William of Ockham and Scotus. Now, you get here to modern times, and Bavinck notes that you can think of philosophers like Francis Bacon, John Locke, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill, Herbert Spencer, and others. And one of the key factors in understanding what empiricism is about is this idea Bavinck mentions, that the starting point is always located in the idea that sense perception alone is the source for human knowledge. And he says it this way: empiricism totally subjects the human consciousness to the world outside of us. In the pursuit of knowledge, human beings bring with them nothing but the faculty of perception. Innate ideas, therefore, do not exist. The scientific investigator must set aside all preconceived opinions. From the temple of truth, which he aspires to construct in his mind, he must remove all idol. No anticipation of the mind, but the interpretation of nature, just experience, must lead him. And so therefore, Bavinck talks about the empiricist having this idea that the human mind starts as a tabula rasa, so a white table. Think here of an empty notebook on which nothing has as yet been written, an entity completely devoid of presupposition. Now, knowledge is trustworthy only when it is constructed out of the material of perception. And we have here the peripatetic axiom. There is nothing in the mind that was not first in the sense. And the idea is mentioned, as you indicated here, there is no science of the supersensible, and the supernatural is therefore impossible. And so you have this idea that there are objects that materially relate, of which we are one, and as we stumble in the dark, armed with only our senses, we must discover them. Now, here's one way that I think about it, Chuck, and I don't know if this will relate to everyone, but I'm used to playing games. So think of war games on the computer. So virtual war games. And very often in these virtual war games, the player starts as a player at a certain starting point in this virtual world. And all around him is the unexplored world, and it is beyond his vision. And so he can make no statements about this virtual world. It's all black until, playing this game, one sends out a scout, one sends out one's own army to try to go out and reconnoiter and do observations about what are the things in this virtual world. And so from my home base, I reach out with my infantry and I discover that there's a road going out of the northeast part of the base that I have, and that there's a field and there's gardens to the west. To the north of me, maybe there's a lake and there are mountains to the south. And so this process of uncovering something that latently exists there only and completely through my means of perception is a very empirical idea. And so you can see, Chuck, how if I start with this idea that the primacy of knowledge is limited to things within sensory reach, you can understand why that might lead me to become materialistic in my outlook. And so I might have a preference. There is no such thing as abstract entities. There is nothing other than what I can in some way and in somehow perceive through my senses. And so we can see here now why I'm going to have some difficulties speaking about an empirical perspective, because I feel it's very foreign to me. It's very difficult for me to get out of my own mind, as it were, and to think solely in that fashion. Now, I say difficult, I don't mean impossible, and I don't mean that they're not localized spheres. But when we get into metaphysics, when we get into the presumed nature of reality that we live in, it strikes me that it's a very bad idea to limit reality to only the things that I can materially perceive, or things that can derive from that. And this is a very hard precept and school of thought for me to represent fairly. And as a matter of fact, if we ever had guests on, I would love to have an empiricist to be able to speak here a little bit better, because I feel like an English speaker who is not very familiar with another language, trying to talk about involved issues associated with that language. So if I spoke Latin, and maybe just at a very basic level, and I tried to tell you what Latin was like and what it was about, that's how I feel here with empiricism. And so this section from Bavinck is really helpful. And I just wonder, now, this is me reading a little bit more into the chapter and in the text than Professor Bavinck gives us, but I actually wonder if perhaps Bavinck is not also in that same direction. You know, I think he's being accurate, but I'm not sure that he has the same intuitive, natural feeling into understanding empirical thought that he does in rationalistic thought. And I think that's a very human way to be, but it's just worth noting. And Chuck, I just wondered, in terms of, conceiving of, quote unquote, the other side, how do you feel about that? And what are the kind of ways in which you can relate to this school and how Bavinck's writing about it?
I agree with you that Bavinck, I think, not directly, but indirectly betrays the idea that he is even less comfortable with empiricism than he is with sort of the rationalism of Immanuel Kant and who followed him. And I think there are some good reasons for that, right? You as you pointed out, the natural result, I think, of a pure empiricism is materialism. We exist, for ourselves, forget about everybody else and get what you want and get what you need and get what makes you happy. And I think most people recognize that that's a problem, that's not the way the world needs to work. There are some exceptions to that, and Rand, might not agree with that, but generally, I think, people understand that a pure materialism is a negative thing for the world. And yet, we still often get trapped into this empirical way of looking at the world. And therefore, we sort of often, I think people get dragged into, willingly or otherwise, a sort of quasi-materialism. All you have to do is look at television, right? And it's all about, get what you can now, get what makes you feel happy, do you, don't worry about, others, except for as in a way that it makes you feel better. That is sort of a very materialist way of thinking. And we soften the edges of it somewhat, recognizing the problems of a full-throated materialism. But certainly a Christian can very much speak against materialism. And if empiricism inevitably leads to materialism, and I know there are some empiricists who say it doesn't, but it certainly seems to head in that direction, and that clearly is problematic. And I think it's an easier problem to see than perhaps some of the issues that we might have with rationalism, if only because, at least with rationalism, where rather than all that matters being what is on the outside, nature, what we perceive, but rather with rationalism, what matters is what we create in our minds. I think we can apply a sense of God to that, right? That God behaves in rational ways. He's given us a mind so that we can perceive, things beyond simply just nature. And frankly, I think there is a sense in which, when we get to it, the realism that Bavinck talks about and others as well, I think he borrows far more from the rationalist side of Aristotle's arch than from the empirical side. Now, that being said, again, we tend to naturally fall into a sort of empiricism because it's just the way the world works, right? We see things, we react to them. We try to explain things based on, how people react to things. And I was reading with you some of the things that Bavinck was using and was saying to describe how empiricists think. There's a sense in which you think of a lot of the ideas that the world has, right? I have heard it said, for example, that, well, no one is naturally a racist. They only become racist because they've got racist parents who teach them to be racist. Well, that's an idea that there's this tabula rasa. And, if we just color anti-racism onto that tabula rasa, everything will be well and good. And it's only because of those evil racists who paint onto this tabula rasa that we have racism, which totally ignores the idea of sin. The fact that we have racism, both individual and structural, is a direct result of original and actual sin. And, empiricism can't account for original sin. It can't account for the fact that sin may be that we have a fallen nature, right? That it's more than just we learn from the sins of others. In many ways, empiricists are very Pelagian, but you see those kinds of ideas all the time. I think we see it as well in questions about how do we deal with issues around mental health? How do we deal with issues around poverty? How do we deal with all sorts of political issues? If we really think that people are a tabula rasa, well, then I think, then the solution is just simply to legislate that something happens before the tabula rasa, and you get the good things written before the bad, and there you go. We'll solve all the problems of the world. And again, we know that that's not the case. So yeah, it's important to recognize that even as empiricism may be losing its power in the academic world, in the everyday world, it still has its power, and it has its negative impacts that we see around us. It has the negative impacts of materialism. It has the negative impacts of believing that we can, just solve problems by shifting the nature around us, which is interesting because if you really go full on empiricist, then you can't change that because, how can minds ever perceive that? Racism must just be natural. It must just be a normal thing. It must be survival of the fittest, right? But of course, nobody wants to go quite that far. Maybe they start climbing up Aristotle's arch a little bit once you get to that point, but without recognizing how far they've gotten already once they're there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. I think we face some difficulties here in terms of giving the empiricist our most generous critique, perhaps because, and maybe I shouldn't speak for you, but this is one of the areas that my philosophical sense is the least well developed in. I really do find empirically minded folks to be speaking a different language and to really have views of reality that are just so contrary to my own understanding. And I noticed this too in Bavinck. I mentioned it before that I had a suspicion that he's more comfortable speaking about the rationalist side than the empiricist side. And in this section here, I think we have 6 paragraphs in the essay on empiricism. And unfortunately, I believe that 4 of the 6 are chapters criticizing empiricism and why it cannot be. And so in that sense, I'm not sure we do empiricists as much justice as we would love to. But it's not from a lack of trying. It's from a genuine inability to think empirically, if that makes sense. One of the things areas where this manifests are in some of the different language groupings. So, for example, Chuck, when you and I speak, we speak about a human soul, and we speak about a human mind, and you and I speak as if these things we can just take for granted that they exist, and yet no one has been able to point to a human mind. And as for a soul, well, empirically minded folks might even challenge whether or not there is such a thing. And so we'll see instead people on the empirical side will change the language and not necessarily speak so much of mind, so much as they'll talk about brain, the human brain, your brain, my brain. You and I will say our soul has knowledge, our mind has knowledge, and maybe an empiricist will say your mind has that knowledge, and I'm sorry, your brain has that knowledge, and my brain has that knowledge. And so just in those conceptions, we find that in some sense we are one species of persons speaking two different worldviews. And I've wondered at times if it would be helpful and worthwhile to just maybe take a year or two and invest in one of the classic empiricists. And so maybe that would be Locke, maybe that would be Hume, maybe that would be Berkeley. I think this idea, however, is ultimately a very difficult one to talk about. For if one limits one's self to sense perceptions, then we have to ask, well, which ones? And classically, empiricists have talked about, the five senses: sight, smell, touch, hearing. Oh, Chuck, I'm losing it here. Which ones am I missing? Taste and okay, boy, I'm definitely embarrassed.
I think you said them. You said them now.
Okay.
Yeah, sight, hearing, and taste, and smell, and touch.
Yeah, and the idea is that I think the first question I have is, what about other senses? And I think even empiricists can speak about other things being senses for humankind. But here's the issue. What about a sense of humor? What about a sense of irony? What about any of these other senses that seem to live and move and breathe in the incorporeal space? And even empiricists seem to acknowledge that incorporeal things like text exist, words, language, fact objects, mathematical concepts, numbers, all sorts of things that really are very difficult to derive solely from the five senses or in a peripatetic way. And that's going to make this difficult. One other interesting thing that makes this difficult as well, but perhaps is convincing me that there's value in studying a good empiricist philosophy for some time, is that many, if not most, of the modern secular schools of thought have come from the empiricist side more than the rational side. And so that when you talk to people who are skeptical, thinking back to very early levels, what were some of the original objections that you hear in secular society as it provides a critique? Where is God? I don't see him. I don't smell him. Can't point to him. I can't touch him. And, why do we need God when we can explain things without God? There's also ideas related to how can we even speak about morality in the sense of an objective right or wrong. And indeed, maybe perhaps many, if not most, empiricists might hold to some form of relativism in which there is no objective truth. Or perhaps, maybe said another way, truth is a function of the observing individual. And Chuck, if it's not obvious, I'm struggling here because I'm so far away. I'm so outside of the orbit of empirical thinking that I'm really not doing them justice. And maybe that's just pointing out an area for study in the future for me. To be honest with you, I'm not sure how much I would want to do that. It would be like, learning a second language, but it would be the second language of some of your most difficult, not enemies, but opposition. And yet, if we're going to represent them well, maybe that's needed. And I'm flailing a little bit here, trying to give them a generous read. Let me throw it over to you. Do you feel anything similar here? Should we have maybe tried to book a good empiricist friend to come on and maybe talk about some of the foundational bases and beginnings and what it's all about, sort of thing?
Perhaps, again, because I think there is a sense in which in the academic world, empiricism is on the wane. It may not be as important today as it might have been even just 10, 20 years ago. But then again, as we've talked about, there is a sense in which there are a lot of practical empiricists out there. Now, I do think, I have one friend especially who she really does hold to a very empiricist way of thinking. She is very much an atheist and very much believes that realistically the world can be explained entirely through the scientific method, and that the scientific method really is about observing what is actually happening. So she talks a lot about what's truthful and what's false, and anything that can't be proven scientifically to her is false. She doesn't bother to move to that area where some empiricists go that just say, well, science can't deal with those. Now, I know I haven't been the one to do this, but I know that people that she's engaged with have tried to make the materialist or the anti-materialist argument to her, saying, look, your view is this is what it leads to. And I think her answer to that is the answer that many empiricists today, or given that it's waning 20 years ago, would have given, which is she argues that empirically we can see that living in community and behaving in a way that takes into account those around us is good for society, and therefore there is an empirical basis for doing more than just simply an individualist, materialist way of thinking. She would say that it's clear empirically that societies where people work together succeed, and societies where people break off into just simply individuals, they fall apart. The whole all for one, one for all, and divided we fall, together united we stand kind of way of thinking. And I think that is an empiricist's one way that empiricists will answer that as a way of avoiding going completely into naturalism. I think as well, there is a sense in which even I suspect there are Christians, or at least religious people, who fall into sort of an empiricist way of thinking, who would describe God in a very different way than you or I would describe God in a very different way, in my opinion, than what Scripture does, but tend to think of God as, Mother Nature, or just the, how things work. God is in all. We can't perceive him, and, it's not really that there is this separate thing called God. God is, among us, with us, through us, part of us. Maybe even we are God. I think that there are some empiricists who fall into that as well. And by the way, rational as well. I don't think that's necessarily particularly unique to one or the other side of the Aristotelian arch. And so I think there are some answers that empiricists give. And, given that, it may be, we don't know, it may be that there's just a natural ebb and flow going on between rationalism and empiricism. We just happen to be in the ebb time for empiricism, and it may come back, and it may be worthwhile to prepare for when it does, when it rolls in or floods like a tsunami even, who knows? Although it does, at least in some ways, I hate to put it this way, but it almost feels like that perhaps the pendulum has gone so far away from that, and that postmodernism really is, very unfriendly to empiricism because of their unwillingness of some postmoderns anyway, to even accept that there is just one answer to things, right? And, empiricists, traditional empiricists would say, well, you sense things, and there are things that are true and there are things that are false. And what you observe, with the senses allows you to see what truth is. And falsehood only comes in when we try to avoid those things and create things that aren't there. That seems to be, postmoderns seem to be very unfriendly to that idea. And it may be that we won't see a return in the same way empiricism. On the other hand, I agree with you. There is a sense in which I think there is enough there, whether we bring in an empiricist philosopher or we just bring in, somebody who lives their life that way. I know you may be aware of a radio program. Well, it's not just on the radio anymore, called the White Horse Inn. The White Horse Inn were a number of was a reformed pastor and a professor out of Westminster Seminary out in Escondido, California, who were part of it, but they brought in some other thinkers as well. There was a Lutheran who was on there. I think they've recently added a Baptist to the panel. But anyway, on the White Horse Inn, the role there is to think Christianly and think deeply, and primarily from a Reformed perspective, about the issues of the world and to engage with them seriously. And there were a number of those episodes of the White Horse Inn that I recall where, they had a man on the street and they just went out. I don't know where they did it, whether they went to downtown LA or if they were just on the streets of Escondido. I don't know. But they would talk to people on the street and just get a sense of what they were thinking about things. And I found that to be a very useful way of seeing, what is really out there. It's not so much oftentimes it's not so much the thinkers where they are today that matters. It's where the sort of the naive thinkers, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, because I think most of us are naive thinkers, at least much of the time, but it's where are the naive thinkers that really ends up mattering. Now, it may be that academia shapes naive thinking to the point where eventually we'll see naive thinking moving in the directions where we see academia going today. I think there's probably some truth to that. But yeah, just going out on the street and asking people, what do they think about, how do you know whether something is true? What can something, can something exist if you can't see it, if you can't hear it, if you can't touch it, if you can't taste it, if you just think something up, is that real? And I suspect you'll get a number of people who give empiricist answers to those kinds of questions, in a knee-jerk kind of way. So in that sense, I think it is still important to look at these issues. There's one other thing I think is worth pointing out here as well, and it comes, I think it's at the end of paragraph 67, right before he gets to a section about the priority of the senses. And what Bavinck talks about here is I think he's trying to be fair to empiricism, while also I think he does show a little bit of his sense. Prefers, if you're going to go down one side of this archer or the other, you may prefer that rationalist side. But he describes the difference between these two things this way. He says, rationalism, as it were, forces things to align themselves with the intellect, presses them into forms of which it does not know whether things fit them, and constructs the world in terms of a set of concepts. Empiricism forces the intellect to align itself with a sensible world, curtails it in its ideal development, and finally explains the intellect itself in terms of matter. I think you can, take these to their extremes and find problems with both of them, right? Rationalism forces things to align themselves with the intellect, and especially if we're thinking of the human intellect, we're constructing the world in the form that our minds decide that they're going to be, and that really puts the human mind as central. Empiricism forces the intellect to align itself with the sensible world. Now, to some empiricists, that may say, hey, yeah, exactly. You can't just be thinking about things because you want your mind to go in a particular direction. You have to take into account the world around you. But then Bavinck points out it curtails it in its ideal development and explains the intellect itself in terms of matter, that in the end, that's all that matters is matter. And if you're going to try to develop things in an idealistic kind of way, you're never going to get there with empiricism. And in some ways, that means that the very project of putting together a systematic theology, putting together a set of dogmas and studying them, that just doesn't fit under an empirical way of thinking. But then he adds this. He says, but the theory of knowledge that gradually arose in Christian theology and its basic features was first conceived by Augustine, maintains both the freedom and the constraints of the human mind. The freedom to soar to the world of the ideal, the constraints that in this upward flight keep it from losing touch with the world of reality. And I think, obviously there's a whole nother section before he gets to, I think that actually might be in the realist section where he starts to get there. But yeah, I have moved over into the realist section. But I think that really is an ideal way for Bavinck to explain that, hey, we need a little bit of empiricism to keep us from just floating off into the never land. But we also need to have some level of rationalism and freedom that the mind has in rationalism to really think through things. But let's not get caught so far into that we lose touch with reality. Yeah, I think then we'll start with, I think we're going to spend some more time the next time we meet on realism. But, Bavinck's solution here is not, to say a pox on both your houses necessarily. It's also not a Kantian synthesis, but rather it is to some extent saying, look, there are some things we can learn from each, but in the end, Christian thinkers need to think Christianly about these things. We can take into account what others are saying, but we don't necessarily have to just come up with a synthesis. Now, to be fair, I understand, again, there are critics who accuse Bavinck of doing just that, of providing a synthesis. I just don't think that's, in my mind, I don't think that's what I don't know, what do you think about that?
Chuck, I love that. I love that point of discussion because it humanizes rationalism and empiricism and imparts a personal flavor to what it means to be a part of either category, which I think is really helpful. Now, when we think about empiricism, I could imagine a listener could listen to us and hear my short, ineffective attempt to articulate a viable empiricism and think, well, boy, listening to Chuck and Brock, it should be pretty clear that there's really it's even hard to understand why empiricism has been such a dominant part of philosophy over the past 2,000 years. And that's entirely due to my own difficulties in being able to understand the landscape. One of the things that grounds me and pulls me over toward the empirical side is what I think most people would consider the crown jewels of empirical thought. And that is the scientific method. Now, I don't want to make the case as if only empiricists were scientists or performed using a scientific method. But, when you really look at the modern pushes, you see an embrace of science in this sort of crown jewel way. And if I can speak from my perspective and my experience, I would almost say that modernity is in some sense a religion of science. Now, that's an arguable point, but the point is that science, in the modern narratives, science has expanded to fill and capture the human imagination with explanations for how and why things are the way they are in reality. And I think it's done quite well. And if you look at science in its core sense, I have no problems there. What happens, though, is we tend to see what some have called a scientific expansionism. Other people have used the term scientism. And there's this idea that science is, in some sense, the right way of thinking. This is also linked with modern ideas of the myth of progress. Oh, Chuck, we used to believe in things like faith, but now we're modern, we've advanced, we've moved forward, we have science. And I think empirically oriented minds are captured by such ways of thinking very, very often. And you have related to this idea that if it cannot be weighed, if it cannot be measured, if it cannot be counted, then it doesn't count. And so you have this sort of practical nearing mindset that wishes to play within a certain phenomenal subset of reality. And if that is all reality is, if there's nothing more to reality than what we ourselves encounter through self when we participate in the world, then who wouldn't perhaps be an empiricist? Now, the difficulty comes, of course, with believing or considering the idea that there are lots of reasons to think that starting with self is a very bad idea. Let's suppose, Chuck, that if we took our video game analogy from earlier, and if my world consisted only of the things that I myself have individually encountered, well, that would be a very small subset of the world. Now, if we expanded that to include not only what I've encountered, but what I and my friends have encountered, well, that would be a larger part of the world, but still a subset of reality. There would be so much on the earth that my and my friends' understanding would be leaving out. Now, suppose we expand this to the aspects of the world as is theoretically understood by the 8+ billion people who are alive today. Well, that's really interesting, Chuck, because I would say conceptually that among the 8 billion people who are alive, I would say the totality of an aggregate human understanding of the world, we could make the case that in some sense we've really mapped this world that we live on. And so here's the question: is empiricism more like that? In other words, if we just had more data, if we just had more observers, if we just had better instruments for measuring, if we just had methods for better and more rigorous calculation, can we see to the edge of reality in all of its dimensions? And I think an empiricist has to have an optimism there. They have to think that in some fashion, yeah, if it matters to me, then it has to show up in this kind of inquiry, this observational-based inquiry. Whereas I think somebody more on the rationalistic side is going to look and say, wait a minute, it's very conceivable that there are things that, to my mind, are not conceivable. And yet, their reality should not be questioned or rejected, let's put it that way, per se. And so in that sense, if the rationalists are right, or perhaps it's better said, if the non-materialists are right, then starting points within self, starting points with the scientific method at front and center, are ultimately going to only ever be capable of seeing a very small part of reality. And so that's the landscape. And I don't think that the rationalist is therefore in a better place than the empiricist, nor that the empiricist is in the better place than the rationalist. I think Bavinck points out well in this chapter that together both of them give the thinking rational being, and I don't mean here in the rationalistic sense, but the rational man, the idea that Bavinck will have, and of course other thinkers as well, of the human as this rational being moving in a world informed by more than sense, informed by mind. And we Christians are going to argue that we are not only informed by more than our senses, even more than our aggregate human understanding of things. Chuck, we're going to say that we are informed by God himself, the creator of this universe, this reality that we live in. And on that basis, we can see, standing on top of that revelation, we can see ever so much further out into the distance than someone who's more empirical in their mindset. Now, Chuck, of course, this is where the empiricist will say, yes, but you're standing on nothing. And that's where, we can have endless dialogues with folks on different sides of that. And it really is a fun problem to discuss. Now, Chuck, with that in mind, we've had a chance to step through. I'm not sure that, at least from my point of view, I would really love to grow in the direction of understanding my empiricist-minded friends better. And I think that'll be maybe a to-do thing on the list of things in my studies in philosophy. Let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts on this section and wrapping it up, rationalism versus empiricism, because we're going to get into the latter half of this chapter and how Bavinck takes it in a very interesting turn.
Yeah, I think you've wrapped it up really well, quite frankly, wrapped it up as well as I would have, if not better. I am looking forward, I think, to talking about what Bavinck says about realism in the second half of this chapter, because I think there is a lot there that's pretty important. It's pretty deep, and there's probably a real opportunity to learn again from Bavinck. But I do think that this second half of this chapter, this section on realism, is really going to be another really important part of sort of the foundations that Bavinck is setting in this volume.